Let me ask you something. Imagine you work just as hard as your colleague. You have the same qualifications, the same experience, the same ambitions. But when you apply for the same job, they get the call back. When you go to the bank for a mortgage, they hesitate. When you walk into a hospital in pain, they don't take you as seriously. And when you walk down the street at night, you are watched. Now, imagine this isn't just your story, it's your parents' story, your grandparents' story, and for millions of people around the world. It goes back much further than that. This is the reality for Black people in many parts of the world. And today we are going to talk about why, honestly, clearly, and without watering it down. Not to make anyone feel guilty, not to argue about politics, but because understanding a problem properly is the only way we ever can actually fix it. So let's go back to the beginning. The title of this write up is Why Black People Face Racism and Segregation. The full story. Chapter 1. It didn't happen by accident. Drum roll. Ta-dum. The first thing you need to understand is this: racism against black people was not some natural thing that just appeared. It was built deliberately by people with a very clear reason for building it. Between the between the 1500s and the 1800s, an estimated 12.5 million African people were forcibly taken from their homes, packed onto ships in horrifying conditions, and sold as slaves across the Americas, the Caribbean, and Europe. This wasn't a small event. This was one of the largest and most organized systems of human exploitation in recorded history. It lasted for roughly 400 years, longer than the United States has even existed as a country. Now, here's the thing: the people running this system, the plantation owners, the merchants, the governments, many of them called themselves Christians. Many of them believed, or at least said they believed, in human dignity. So, they had a problem. How do you enslave millions of people and still sleep at night? Simple. You tell yourself and everyone else that they are not really people. Not in the full sense. You invent a story. You say they are less intelligent, less civilized, less capable of feeling pain. You get scientists to write papers supporting this idea. You get churches to preach it. You build it into your laws, your newspapers, your school books. This is where racism as we know it comes from. It wasn't discovered, it was manufactured as a tool to justify profit. And here is the part that matters most. When the system was eventually abolished, nobody went through and removed all those ideas. They stayed in people's heads, in the structures of society, in the laws and habits and assumptions that had been built around them for centuries. Chapter 2. After slavery, a different kind of chain. A lot of people think the story ends when slavery was abolished. In America, that happened in 1865. But the very next year, Southern states began passing what were known as the Black Codes, laws that made it illegal for black people to own land, to travel freely, or to work for themselves without a white employer's permission. Slavery had a different name now, but it wore the same face. Then came the Jim Crow era. For nearly a century across the American South, black people were legally separated from white people in almost every area of public life. Different schools, different hospitals, different water fountains, different seats on the bus. These weren't just social habits, they were enforced by law and by violence. And in South Africa, something even more systematic was happening. From 1948 to 1994, just 30 years ago, the apartheid system forced black South Africans to carry passbooks just to move around their own country. They were not allowed to live in certain areas, attend certain schools, or use certain beaches. The entire infrastructure of the country was designed to benefit white South Africans at the direct expense of black ones. These weren't fringe policies in small places, they were national systems backed by governments, armies, and courts. Now, both of those systems are officially over. But here is a question worth sitting with. If someone stole from you for 100 years and then go one day, stopped stealing, would you suddenly be equal to them? Of course not. The gap they created doesn't close just because the stealing stops. Chapter 3. Africa. Racism on the continent itself. Now, here is where this conversation takes a turn that most people don't expect. When people talk about racism against black people, they often picture America or Britain or South Africa under apartheid. But there is a story of discrimination, exploitation, and structural inequality happening on the African continent itself. And it deserves its own chapter because it is deeply connected to everything else we've talked about. The colonial blueprint. For centuries, European powers did not just take African people, they took African land, African resources, and African governance. By 1914, European nations, Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, Germany, Italy, controlled roughly 90% of the African continent. This period is called the Scramble for Africa, and it was one of the most consequential acts of organized theft in human history. The borders that were drawn during this period were not drawn with any respect for the people living there. They sliced through existing kingdoms, separated ethnic groups, and crammed rival communities into the same artificial states. Many of the ethnic tensions and civil conflicts that Africa has experienced since independence in Nigeria, Rwanda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan can be traced in part to borders that Europeans drew with rulers on a map with rulers on a map in Berlin in 1884 with no African person in the room. When those nations eventually gained independence, most of them between the 1950s and 1970s, they inherited broken economies, institutions designed for extraction rather than development, and debt to former colonial powers. Some were quite literally forced to keep paying tax. Sorry, some were quite literally forced to keep paying France. For example, required, excuse me, some were quite literally forced to keep paying. France, for example, required its former African colonies to pay what was called a colonial tax, compensation to France for the cost of building infrastructure in their own countries. 14 African nations were still paying this tax until 2010. Some economists argue the argu- some economists argue the arrangement continued in modified forms even after that. The resource course. Africa is the most resource-rich continent on the planet. It holds an estimated 30% of the world's mineral reserves, including cobalt, gold, diamonds, coltan, oil, and uranium. The Democratic Republic of Congo alone contains an estimated $24 trillion in untapped mineral wealth. And yet, by most development measures, it remains one of the poorest regions on Earth. This is not a coincidence. It is the result of a system where the resources live, extracted by multinational corporations, often with the cooperation of local elites. While the profits do not return in proportion, the Global Justice Now organization estimated that in 2015 alone, $203 billion flowed out of Africa through corporate tax evasion, debt repayment, and profit extraction, while only $161 billion flowed in through aid, investment, and loans. Africa is, in net terms, a creditor to the rest of the world, not the other way around. Colorism and internalized hierarchy. There is another dimension of this that is harder to talk about, but equally important. Colonialism did not just steal land and resources, it installed a belief system. It told African people for generations through education systems, religions, institutions, and media that European ways of being were superior, that straighter hair was more professional, that lighter skin was more beautiful, that speaking a European language was a sign of intelligence. The result in many parts of Africa today is a booming skin bleaching industry worth over $8 billion globally, driven almost entirely by people trying to become lighter skinned. In Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, and across East Africa, surveys have been found that between 25% and 77% of women regularly use skin lightening products, many of which contain mercury and steroids with serious long term health consequences. This is not vanity, this is a psychological output of centuries of being told that the way you were born is not good enough. This is what sustained racism does. It doesn't just change your circumstances, eventually, it can change how you see yourself. Poverty and inequality within. Sub Saharan African is home to the largest concentration of extreme poverty on earth. According to the World Bank, roughly 60% of people living on less than $2.15 a day. The International Extreme Poverty Line live in sub-Saharan African lives in sub-Saharan Africa. This is approximately 490 million people. Now, poverty in Africa is not caused by laziness or lack of intelligence. Two myths that have been used to explain it away for centuries. It is the product of colonial extraction, ongoing unfair trade deals, debt structures that drain government budgets, climate change that eats African agriculture hardest despite Africa contributing the least to global emissions and governance problems that are themselves partly a legacy of colonial borders and Cold War interference. The World Health Organization estimates that Africa carries 25% of the world's disease burden, but has access to only 3% of the world's health workers. Life expectancy in sub-Saharan Africa averages around 61 years compared to 79 in Western Europe. Not because African lives Not because African lives matter less, but because the global systems designed to distribute health, wealth, and opportunity were not designed with African people at the center. Modern racism on the continent. And then there is the racism that happens on African soil in the modern day, which takes several forms. In North Africa, Black sub-Saharan Africans attempting to migrate, often fleeing conflict or poverty that has roots in colonial history, face horrifying treatment. In Libya, investigative journalists and the United Nations have documented Black African migrants being sold at open air slave markets for as little as $400. Wow. This is not a metaphor. This is documented 21st century slavery, largely ignored by the international community. In South Africa, even after apartheid ended, inequality along racial lines persists dramatically. White South Africans, who make up roughly 8% of the population, still own the majority of private land and control a disproportionate share of corporate wealth. The Gini coefficient, a measure of inequality in South Africa, is one of the highest in the world. And in recent years, widespread xenophobia against African migrants from other countries has resulted in violent attacks, particularly targeting Zimbabweans and Nigerians. Black Africans discriminating discriminating against other Black Africans. Another psychological footprint of a system that taught people to fight over the scraps left behind. In East Asia, particularly China, Wides widespread prejudice against African people has been documented, from rental discrimination to social exclusion. To during the COVID-19 pandemic, African residents in Guangzhou, Guangzhou being forcibly evicted from their homes and barred from hotels under the false accusations that Africans were spreading the virus. This happened to people who were legal residents, many of whom had been living in China for years. Why this part of the story matters? It matters because when we talk about the global condition of Black people, we cannot draw a neat line around the West and say the problem lives over there. The same logic that justified slavery, that African people and African resources existed to serve the interest of others, is still operating. It has different clothes on. It speaks in the language of investment, trade, debt relief or debt relief, and development aid. But the flow of wealth is largely in the same direction it has always been. Understanding what happened in Africa and why and what is still happening is not about guilt or blame. It is about seeing the full picture, because you cannot understand why Black communities in London or Chicago or Paris are fighting for equality without understanding what happened to the continent those communities came from and what is still happening there today. Chapter 4: The Wealth Gap That Won't Go Away. Let's talk money, because this is where a lot of people apologies. Let's talk money, because this is where a lot of people say, hmm, this might be a grammatical error from ChatGPT. Let's talk money, because where I see where, I'll put what. Let's talk money, because this is what a lot of people say. Well, what they say in quotation, well, that was then. Things are different now. In the United States, the average white family owes about $171,000 more in wealth than the average Black family. Not income, wealth, savings, property, investment, things you can pass on to your children. That gap didn't appear from nowhere. It was built brick by brick through centuries of denied opportunity. After slavery ended, the US government promised freed slaves 40 acres and a mule, lands to start over with. It was never delivered. Instead, programs like the GI Bill after World War II, which helped millions of veterans buy homes and go to university largely excluded black veterans due to local discrimination is how it was administered. Then there was redlining from the 1930s onwards. The US government and private banks literally drew red lines around black neighborhoods on maps and refused to give mortgages or loans to anyone living inside those lines. Black families couldn't buy homes, they couldn't build equity, wealth couldn't compound, the neighborhoods themselves fell apart from lack of investment. And then people pointed at those broken neighborhoods and said, see, this is why we don't invest there. Today, only 45% of black Americans own their home, compared to 74% of white Americans. In the UK, studies have shown that black renters are three times more likely to be refused a property than white renters with identical finances. The discrimination looks different, but it's still there. Chapter 5: The Jobs Problem. Here's an experiment researchers ran. They sent identical CVs to employers, same qualifications, same experience, same everything. The only thing they changed was the name at the top. Names that sounded traditionally white, names that sounded traditionally black. The result, in both the UK and the United States, the white the white sounding names received 50% more callbacks for interviews, 50% for the exact same CV. In the UK, the TUC found in 2022 that black workers are twice as likely to be on a 0 hours contract, meaning no guaranteed hours, no job security, the most precarious form of employment available. Black workers in Britain earn an average £3.80 less per hour more than their white counterparts. And this plays out in corporate leadership too. In the FTSE 100, Britain's 100 biggest companies, there are more CEOs named David than there are black CEOs combined. This is not because black people lack ambition or ability. Every piece of research on these toxic points, every piece of research on this topic points to the same conclusion. It's bias, sometimes conscious, often not. People make decisions about who is the right fit based on unconscious associations built up over a lifetime of absorbing a culture shaped by centuries of racism. Chapter 6: Policing and the Justice System. In England and Wales, black people are 7 times more likely to be stopped and searched by police than white people. 7 times. Not because they commit more crime. The data doesn't support that, but because of a pattern of assumptions about who looks suspicious. In the United States, black Americans are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white Americans. And it's not just the extreme cases, the ones that make the news, like George Floyd or Breonna Taylor. Across thousands of everyday interactions, the pattern is consistent and documented. The justice system compounds this. Black defendants in America are on average given sentences that are 19% longer than white defendants for the same crimes. They are less likely to receive bail, less likely to be believed, more likely to be convicted, and the effects ripple outward. A criminal record limits your ability to get a job, rent a flat, access certain loans. So, policing bias doesn't just affect freedom, it affects every other area of life that follows. Chapter 7: Healthcare. This one is perhaps the most shocking because it involves the most basic human need: staying alive. In the United Kingdom, black women are four times more likely to die during or after childbirth than white women. This is according to the MBRRACE UK reports from 2023. One of the most rigorous maternal health studies in the world. Four times in one of the most advanced healthcare systems in the world. In the United States, the figure is even starker. Black women are 2.6 times more likely to die from pregnancy related complications. And this gap exists even when you control for income and education. Serena Williams, one of the most famous and well resourced athletes in the world, has spoken publicly about nearly dying after the birth of her daughter because medical staff dismissed her concerns when she reported symptoms of a pulmonary embolism. Part of this goes back to something deeply troubling discovered in medical training. Studies found that a significant number of medical students in America had been taught or had absorbed the belief that black patients physically feel less pain than white patients. This has no scientific basis whatsoever. But if a doctor subconsciously they are less believes this, they prescribe less pain relief. They take symptoms less seriously and people die. Chapter 8: In England, black Caribbean pupils are six times more likely to be permanently excluded from school than white British pupils. Six times. And this isn't explained by behavior alone. Studies show that The same behavior is more likely to be punished in a black child than a white child. Once you're excluded, the path ahead narrows sharply. Exclusion is one of the strongest predictors of and is one of the strongest predictors of unemployment, mental health struggles, and involvement in criminal justice system. In Brazil, home to the largest black population outside Africa, the history of slavery and the contributions of African culture were barely taught in schools until a law was passed in 2003 requiring it. Before that, entire generations grew up learning a version of their country's history that erased the people who had built much of it. When children don't see themselves in the curriculum, in the history book, in the teachers at the front of the classroom, it sends a message. It says people who look like you don't belong in places like this. Why does it keep going? So here is the question many people ask. It's been decades since the major civil rights victories. Slavery is long over. Apartheid ended. Jim Crow is gone. So, why is the gap still so wide? The answer comes down to three things. First, time. Centuries of disadvantage don't reverse in a generation. Wealth is passed down. Opportunity is passed down. Connections, networks, the school you go to because of the postcode you grew up in. All of this compounds over generations. The playing field was titled for hundreds of years. You can't flatten it overnight. Second, structural momentum. Racist outcomes don't require racist intentions to continue. A hiring algorithm trained on historical data will replicate historical bias. A school disciplinary system shaped in a racially unequal society will continue producing unequal outcomes unless someone actively changes it. The machine keeps running even after you've turned off the power because the parts are still in motion. Third, invisibility. If you're not the one being affected by it, it's very easy not to see it. When your experience of the world is the norm, when your name gets callbacks, when your name gets callbacks, when the police don't stop you, when the doctor takes your pain seriously, it's genuinely difficult to imagine that the system works differently for someone else. This isn't necessarily malice, it's the natural result of living inside a system that was built to serve you. Here's the outro. What now? None of this is meant to make anyone feel guilty for something they personally did not do. But understanding how we got here clearly, honestly, with real numbers is the starting point for anything changing. The countries that have made the most progress on racial inequality share one thing in common. They looked at the problem directly, they named it, they measured it, they changed specific laws, specific systems, specific practices, not just attitudes. Because this was never just about individual prejudice, it was about, it was always also about systems. And systems, unlike arts, can be changed deliberately, measurably, and faster than most people think. Africa's story is part of this too. You cannot fully understand why Black communities around the world are fighting for equality without understanding what was taken from the continent they came from and what continues to flow out of it today. This is a global story. It has no single villain and no single solution, but it does have a clear thread running through it. Centuries of decisions made by people in power that placed Black lives and Black futures at, at the bottom of the list. Knowing that isn't the end, knowing that isn't the end of the conversation. It's the beginning of an honest one. If this gave you something to think about, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Every statistic referenced in this video is linked in the description of this video. Like and subscribe. You know you want to. And in my next video, I'll act more serious. But in conclusion, the truth is, I was meant to be very remorseful and sad about reading all that. And I am.